Louisiana, a land rich in history and resources, originally the home of the Natchez, the Houma, and the Choctaw, but the adopted home of Iberville, Bienville, and Tonti. Louisiana, the focus of international struggle and intrigue for centuries, a place of mystique, the home of a people known for distinct culture and institutions, the parish and police jury. Louisiana, that catalyst for transforming the former British North American colonies into a national melting pot. Louisiana, the birthplace of jazz, the refinement of blues and the gospel, the source of Creole and Cajun food, the home of Huey Long and Evangeline, Lee Armstrong and Marie Laveau. The Louisiana Purchase, arguably the world's most significant real estate transaction, will be the subject of this semester-long series, both on its immediate importance but its continuing impact today. Hello again, and welcome to the sixth in our continuing series on the Louisiana Purchase. The lecturer for week 6 is a native New Orleanian, Dr. Gerald P. Bodet, history professor emeritus. Bodet was a member of the Department of History from 1963 until 2001. Professor Bodet served several terms as department chair. In his lecture, he will focus on the relationship of Great Britain to former North American colonies after the American Revolution. Although the British formally recognized American independence and ceded to them much of their territory from 1783 until 1815, Britain encouraged and supported separatist movements in the Old Northwest and expanded Florida in the Southeast. British officials, soldiers, and foreign traders conspired with wary Indian tribes and disgruntled Easterners and impatient Westerners who felt detached from their federal government. And in response to the purchase, British officials at home and abroad worked to nullify the treaty by dismembering the United States and annexing the Mississippi River Valley. Their plans ultimately met with total failure when they encountered Andrew Jackson on the battlefield south of New Orleans.
In the 1995 film, The Madness of King George, there is a scene in which the king, glowering at a globe, referred to the newly independent America as the colonies. When the Prime Minister William Pitt reminded the king that the territory was now styled the United States of America, George only grumbled as if to deny the fact. Many Englishmen seemed to share George's stubborn disbelief, for to accept American sovereignty would be an admission that Britain no longer exercised influence in America south of the Great Lakes. In the years between 1783 and 1815, Britain pursued policies which it hoped would reestablish its control, either directly or through surrogates, to that huge swath of American territory that lay between the Great Lakes and the Gulf Coast. During that 32-year period, Britain received rebuff after rebuff, but it kept reinventing the project as new players emerged. Though it promised in Jay's Treaty to abandon its old Northwest forts, and though it looked on with approval when America purchased Louisiana, Britain continued to seek ways of establishing a presence in the region. Imperial administrators from Canada, fur traders, merchants, and former Loyalists found friendly ears in London, from senior Tory cabinet officials like Henry Dundas, William Pitt, Spencer Perceval, Lord Liverpool, and Viscount Castlereagh. In this hour, we will examine the British presence in North America from 1783 to 1815. Many reasons can be cited to explain Britain's continued interest in maintaining a presence in the Mississippi Valley, among them preserving a buffer zone between America and Canada, protecting the lands of the Indian tribes of the Old Northwest and their lucrative fur trade, and providing havens for Loyalists still in America. Timely British intervention might support the often proposed secession of the New England states from America, or keep Americans from seizing the lands of the Indian tribes in the Old Southwest and the timber-rich Gulf Coast region. Yet, all these reasons for direct and vigorous intervention, compelling as they were, failed to command the full resources of Britain. After 1789, the American mainland had to give way in priority to the European mainland, and with every passing year of successful American possession, British intervention in the Old Northwest and the Mississippi Valley became less likely to succeed. For a time, fear of France even promoted friendship with America, uneasy as it was. Yet the plans were never abandoned, nor were their proponents silenced. After Napoleon's demise, the time for British intervention seemed right, and events went forward to their tragic denouement at the Battle of New Orleans here on this battlefield in Chalmette in January of 1815. To understand British involvement on the American mainland, we should begin with the decisive Treaty of 1783, in which Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States, surrendering to America all of its territory west of the Appalachians and south of the Great Lakes. The Mississippi now became the nation's new western boundary, and Florida, in Spanish hands, the southern boundary. The Old Northwest, an area south of the Great Lakes and down to the Ohio River, which would ultimately include the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, was in 1783 populated by Amerindians, fur-bearing animals, a few coureurs de bois, and fur traders protected by British forts and trading posts. Most of it had been made a part of Canada by the Quebec Act of 1773, and the Canadian fur traders were loath to part with it. But British negotiators at Paris, in their haste to complete the treaty and end the Revolutionary War, had handed the entire territory over to the Americans. Immediately as the terms were known, the Anglo-Canadians let out a tumultuous cry of anguish that was soon heard in London. London reconsidered. Perhaps the evacuation of the Ohio Valley should not take place immediately, not only because it was a first line of defense for Canada, but also because of lost fur trade profits. What was this fur trade we hear so much about? To appreciate it, we have to transport ourselves to a cold and drafty Europe in which furs were not only the best protection for a shivering body, but also the mark of the highest clothing style. Beaver pelts were especially sought after because they contained tiny barbs that locked together and kept the wearer dry as well as warm. 200 years before the Europeans came to America, the beaver was gone in England and Scotland. He had all but disappeared in Russia when he was rediscovered in Canada, New England, and Virginia, being worn by Native Americans. The Indians soon realized that colonists would readily part with iron tools, pots, and weapons for these pelts, and thus was struck what Alice Outwater called a Faustian bargain. The Indians became the hunters, the Europeans the traders, in a program which drove the beaver and other fur bearers nearly to extinction, and as it rolled westward, made the Indians superfluous. But at the time, the supply appeared inexhaustible. The profits were immense, and they were funneled through Montreal. Between 1763 and 83, British traders from Montreal enriched themselves grandly from the fur trade. American diplomatic historian Samuel F. Bemis put the British take at 200,000 pounds a year, a princely sum, and like oil today, capable of redirecting a nation's political agenda. And what of the Indians? In the mid-18th century struggle between France and Britain, and in the later Revolutionary War between the colonists and Britain, American Indians were caught in the crossfire. With whom should they side? The first choice was the French, who as coureurs de bois tread lightly in the forest, intermarrying with the natives to create a symbiotic fur-trapping union that enriched both groups. American colonists, on the other hand, forcibly pushed the Indians westward and took ancestral lands for tobacco plantations and family farms. Of the English colonists, an Iroquois said, "No sooner do they get possession of a country than the game is forced to leave it, the trees fall down before them, and the earth becomes bare." In the aftermath of the French defeat in 1763, Britain acquired all of French Canada, the Old Northwest, and the Mississippi Valley, and with it the fur trade. To ensure the trade's continuance, Britain felt it must keep British colonists out of the area. This it did by the Proclamation of 1763, which reserved these lands for the Indians, forbade colonial purchase or settlement, and allowed only licensed traders to enter. Thus began Britain's long involvement in the Old Northwest as traders and protectors of the Indians there. The area in 1783 was thinly populated, but included more than 150,000 American Indians of the Six Nations, the Shawnees, and the Algonquins. Scattered on the fringes were about 50,000 American colonists, the vanguard of the more than 3 million who lived east of the Appalachians. While the British claimed sovereignty, they allowed that the Indians were entitled to usufruct, or use of the land, as wards of the British government. In ceding sovereignty to the Americans in 1783, the British insisted that the Indians should continue to have use of it. To Americans, this smacked of legal pettifoggery. The land was theirs, and the Indians had to yield. In 1783, the British still held forts and trading posts throughout the Old Northwest. Detroit, Michilimackinac, Niagara, Oswego, and others were in remote wilderness areas and were critical to the fur trade. The governor of Canada urged delay so that fur traders could get their goods to market before Americans took over. Thomas Townshend, Lord Sydney, Home Office Secretary, noted that the treaty had said evacuation should begin, quote, with all convenient speed, unquote, meaning there was no hurry. As we remember from a similar admonition on school desegregation, school at a speed that is convenient or deliberate may take years to complete, and so it was. Sydney urged the Indians to remain steadfast in their belief that the land was still theirs. Mohawk Chief Joseph Brant did just that, declaring that all land north of the Ohio had been ceded to the Indians in the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768, which he claimed was still in force. Brant visited London in 1785 and was told by the British that while the government could give no open encouragement, it would not leave the Indians to the mercy of the Americans. No open encouragement did not preclude sending supplies. In 1784 alone, supplies from Detroit to the Indians numbered 10,000 ball and shot, 500 pounds of gunpowder, and 100 rifle guns. By a remarkable bit of sophistry, British authorities claimed that these guns and shots were for hunting beaver pelts, and no harm was intended to Americans. Americans were convinced, however, that all British merchants were Tory traders, married to Indian women, greedy, lustful, grasping men who stirred up Indians to massacre innocent pioneers. Between 1783 and 1790, the American government, beset by problems on all sides, did little to force Britain out of the forts and posts of the Old Northwest. Merely holding the territory was a challenge. In days before canals and railroads, the land west of the Appalachians, including western Pennsylvania, was more easily connected to New Orleans by river than it was to Philadelphia by land. As settlers moved into the area, however, the U.S. government acted. In 1790, Josiah Harmore led an expedition against the Shawnees from Fort Washington, present-day Cincinnati, but was driven back. The following year, a larger force under Arthur St. Clair moved out from Fort Washington and was surprised and mauled, losing 600 dead to a Shawnee force whose weapons came from British agents. It was an American disaster comparable to Braddock's defeat in 1755. Indian successes emboldened Henry Clinton, Member of Parliament and former British Revolutionary Army general, to urge on the cabinet a more forward policy. The moment Britain surrendered the Northwest forts, he said, Canada was lost. He even urged committing regular troops to the area. Official Britain was not ready for that, but those in Canada liked the idea. Guy Carleton, who had driven an American army from Quebec in 1775 and was now Governor General of Canada as Lord Dorchester, thought St. Clair's defeat might induce America to accept the idea of a neutral Indian barrier state in the Ohio Valley. The first step was for Britain to achieve this was to gain recognition as mediator between the Indians and the Americans. Dorchester approached Alexander Hamilton, who was intellectually sympathetic to the British conservative political system. Reportedly, however, Hamilton replied, briefly and coldly, that any cession of territory or right or allowance of any other power to interfere in the disputes with the Indians would be considered as absolutely impracticable and inadmissible. America's disinterest in negotiation alarmed Dorchester. Already a new army was gathering under Mad Anthony Wayne, who wanted a military solution. In 1794, Dorchester addressed delegates of the Northwest Indian tribes, telling them, in Britain's view, the 1768 treaty was still in force, which granted the Ohio boundary to the Indians, and that any U.S. land purchases since 1783 were invalid. John Gray of Simcoe, Lieutenant Governor of Canada, a career military man with an enlarged ego, he wrote his memoirs in the third person in the manner of Julius Caesar, also wanted a military solution. He considered the Americans crafty, scheming, and cunning men who were planning to attack Quebec, and he dreamt of a battlefield confrontation with Washington, whom he called overrated. Simcoe greatly strengthened the defenses of Upper Canada, rebuilt stockades at Detroit and other posts, and enlisted support of a Canadian Loyalist militia and regular soldiers. Simcoe's plan was to move down the Maumee to the Ohio, take Fort Washington, drive out Wayne, and force the Americans to accept as fait accompli an Indian barrier state in the Ohio Valley. But official Britain did not go along. Affairs in Europe were claiming their attention. The French, whose 1789 revolution had been greeted by the British with glee, were again a military force by 1792, having routed the invading Austrians and Prussians from before Paris. Robespierre's Jacobins took power, executing King Louis XVI, invaded the Netherlands, and in April 1793 they declared war on Britain. This was a more serious threat than General Wayne in Cincinnati, mad or excitable though he may be. So when Washington sent John Jay to London with an offer to negotiate, Whitehall responded favorably. Jay was well liked in London. He was a Federalist and believed to be fair. With the arrival of Jay in London, the British government took steps to quiet war fever on the frontier. Lord Dorchester was rebuked for his encouragement of Indian hostility and for his fort building. He resigned as Governor of Canada. But if the British hoped to gain concessions from Jay, they were disappointed. In the treaty, finally signed in November 1794, Britain agreed to evacuate the forts and pay compensation for U.S. ships taken in the West Indies. The Americans, in turn, agreed to pay debts owed to British Loyalists. Nothing was said about an Indian barrier state, and British efforts to expand the Canadian boundary to a navigable point in the Mississippi were rebuffed. Washington is said to have exploded with rage at the treaty and did not submit it to Congress for 4 months. Nevertheless, leading U.S. diplomatic historians have said that Jay followed instructions and it was as good a treaty as America could get. While the treaty was being negotiated, Wayne began marching into Indian territory, building forts along the way. In August 1794, he advanced up the Maumee River and confronted a small Indian force and some Detroit militiamen behind a tree barricade. After a brief skirmish, referred to by Americans as the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the Indians retreated. They often did when outnumbered, looking for refuge in the British Fort Miami. The garrison, aware of the Dorchester rebuke and ordered not to seek war, closed the gates in the face of the startled Indians who scattered into the woods. Wayne arrived and stationed troops before the fort, but no fighting ensued. A year later, by the Treaty of Grenville, the Indians ceded most of what would become the state of Ohio. Jay's Treaty and the Battle of Fallen Timbers ended a chapter in Britain's policies in the Old Northwest. Britain had reneged on its promises to the Indian tribes. The Fort Stanwix Treaty was a dead letter, and with it, the idea of an Indian confederacy and barrier state in the Old Northwest. Events proceeded rapidly. Wayne destroyed British forts and posts so that British fur traders had to flee to Canada. Native council fires also moved from Detroit to Canada. American land speculators moved in, and for that matter, so did British land speculators. We should now turn to the area south of the Ohio River and west of the Appalachians, referred to as the Old Southwest. Looking at our enhanced United States today, we often forget that the Northwest and Southwest were in closer proximity than they seem now. Florida, whose panhandle in those days stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, was in Spanish hands in 1783, foreshortening the distance between the southern U.S. boundary and the Ohio River. In the Old Southwest live Indians of the Creek, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Muskogean tribes, as determined as their Ohio Valley counterparts to maintain their territory from white incursion. Below the northern Florida boundary were tribes of Creeks and Seminoles, runaway slaves, and British traders. Southern and northern tribal leaders conferred around council fires, struggling to create a confederacy that would protect their lands. During the American Revolutionary War, the South had been the scene of some of the bitterest campaigns and the concluding battles. Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown was the failed end of a Southern strategy in which the British tried unsuccessfully to rally Loyalists of the Carolina Piedmont and to disrupt the Southern slave economies. The violent shock tactics of British commanders like Banastra Tarleton alienated more colonists than it won over. Some, like the 13-year-old Andrew Jackson, became lifelong haters of Britain after being beaten and seeing his family made homeless by one such raid. The other tactic of freeing the slaves in the South also backfired. Early in the war, John Murray Lawn Dunmore issued a proclamation as governor of Virginia declaring free, quote, all indentured servants, Negroes, or others that are able and willing to bear arms, them joining His Majesty's troops. General Henry Clinton in 1779 issued a like declaration. Thousands of slaves did escape to British lines, but there was not the wholesale disruption that was hoped for. Instead, it had the effect among colonial elite of demonizing the British. Said one Southerner, "Hell itself could not have vomited anything more black than the design of emancipating our slaves." The end of the Revolutionary War had placed colonists who were loyal to Great Britain in a perplexing condition. Of the 2.5 million colonials, nearly 400,000 actively supported the British. 100,000 of these went into exile in 1783. Most title ranks and upper administrators returned to England, but the middle sort went to Canada. Loyalists who remained were concentrated in New England, forming a strong pro-British lobby which remained active through 1815. Maine and Vermont were also Loyalist strongholds, so much so that serious plans were laid to join these territories to the Canadian province of New Brunswick. As Canada became a haven for colonial Loyalists in the north, so did Florida serve for Loyalists fleeing southern colonies. The difference here, however, was that Britain lost Florida to Spain during the war and surrendered it at the peace conference. leaving Loyalists and traders stranded in a Spanish colony. From 1783 until 1815, these Loyalists looked for a solution similar to that attempted in the Old Northwest, calling for Britain's recolonization of the area. We have seen that Britain's dreams of a satellite state in the Northwest crashed in 1794. Hopes in the South lingered until 1815. As Britain completed its evacuation of the Northwest forts in 1796 by the terms of Jay's Treaty, France, under a new but still Republican government, became active in the Mississippi Valley. They tried to get Spain to cede Louisiana and Florida to them in 1795 and commissioned Revolutionary War hero George Rogers Clark to court Western frontiersmen on France's behalf. Not that this prospect greatly upset some high Federalists in New England, who thought that granting statehood to Westerners was equivalent to the Romans letting the Goths into the Roman Empire. But at the mere whiff of the Gallic scent in the Mississippi Valley, the British lion became as rigid as a pointing foxhound. From the British minister in Philadelphia, to the cabinet at Whitehall, to naval captains, Loyalists, and Canadians, it became urgent to keep France off the American mainland, and especially out of Florida. America, too, became unnerved by the French, whose attacks on American shipping almost drew a war declaration in 1798. Britain's fear of France returning to the American mainland was further heightened with Napoleon's coup d'etat in 1799 and his wresting of Louisiana from Spain in the Treaty of San Ildefonso. So the British revived plans to preempt France in the Mississippi Valley by naval action at New Orleans, Mobile, and Pensacola. Henry Dundas, Pitt's war secretary, assured the cabinet that it could be done without regular troops. Dundas was relying on intelligence from John Murray, Lord Dunmore, ex-royal governor of Virginia and now governor of the Bahamas. Dunmore's agent was the remarkable William Augustus Bowles, a Loyalist fled from Maryland in 1778. Bowles, a British trader, had married a Creek Indian and was elected a chief. Vehemently anti-Spanish, he declared himself head of the independent Indian state called Muskogee. Unfortunately for Bowles, his efforts to overturn Spanish rule landed him in prisons in Havana, Madrid, and the Philippines in the mid-1790s. He finally escaped to London by way of Sierra Leone in 1798, and the next year he was back in Florida, ready to try once more his plan for Muskogee. His idea for a pro-British independent Indian state intrigued official London. Some may have envisioned him as a 19th century Robert Clive at the head of an army of New World sepoys. For a moment, the old Indian Confederacy crushed by Wayne seemed to revive, as delegates from the Shawnees, the Mohawks, and the Creeks came to a Canadian Indian Council in 1801. But again, Britain reversed itself, agreeing to peace with Napoleon in 1802 in the Treaty of Amiens. For the Loyalists who wanted action on the Gulf Coast, it was a terrible betrayal. Bowles, thinking that Napoleon would quickly goad Britain back into action, promised British aid to a great council of Creeks, Cherokees, Seminoles, Choctaws, and Chickasaws at the Hickory Ground, the present site of Montgomery, if they would elect him their leader. The Indians were not convinced of Britain's good faith. Bowles' enemies, Spanish, American, and competing British traders, seized him, and he ended his life in a Havana jail cell. Then Napoleon changed course again, selling Louisiana to America, a result the British deeply preferred to a French occupation. The British banking house of Baring even loaned Jefferson the money. Of course, official Britain was unhappy to see Napoleon's war chest fattened by 15 million, but other than that, it appeared that with the Louisiana Purchase, British interest in occupying the Mississippi Valley came to an end. But Anglo-American amity did not last long after the Louisiana Purchase. Britain resumed war with France in 1804, and though victorious at Trafalgar in 1805, a string of Napoleonic land victories left Britain's allies defeated and she virtually alone, dependent on sea power. Feeling cornered, Britain exerted her naval supremacy. God and nature having put the power of the ocean into our hands, we are fully entitled to exercise that power for our complete security, ran one British pamphlet. And it was proclaimed in the press that, quote, the sea is ours, and we must maintain the doctrine that no nation, no fleet, no cockboat shall sail upon it without our permission. From the opening of the war with France in 1793, Britain, by orders in council, had arrogated to itself search and seizure powers over neutrals. She had taken U.S. merchant ships and impressed U.S. sailors, offending every American administration. Tensions escalated in 1807 when the British fired upon and boarded the USS Chesapeake and impressed 4 alleged British deserters. Desertions to American ships by British sailors, duty was less arduous and pay was better on American ships, were a problem for Britain. But the practice of impressing on the high seas, rather than in a British port city, was arbitrary and a humiliation of American sovereignty. Jefferson called for an embargo, and in both countries, opinions on war and peace jostled angrily. To British ministers like Spencer Perceval, defeating Napoleon was the only priority, and there could be no concessions to neutrals. He could not understand neutrality at all with tyranny and freedom in the balance. Other Britishers, like Alexander Baring, believed that Britain should allow neutrals free sailing, for America's prosperity would enhance Britain's prosperity. In the U.S., Federalist politicians criticized the embargo and sympathized with Britain, while Westerners like Henry Clay argued strenuously for war against the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, Britain thought again of intervening on the American continent. As early as 1804, British Ambassador Anthony Merry had been listening to Aaron Burr's fantastical schemes, first to join New England and New York to Canada, and then to conspire with General James Wilkinson, U.S. commander in the West, to create an independent Mississippi Valley state. Burr, after being acquitted for treason, traveled to London in 1808 to confer with the British on plans for a tripartite dismemberment of the United States into New England, the Mississippi Valley, and the South, isolating Jefferson and his slaveholders. One tactic discussed was the offer of freedom to the slaves, as had been done in the Revolutionary War. The key to this plan was seizure of New Orleans, from which Britain thought it could control the Mississippi Valley. In discussions among Dundas, Castlereagh, and Canning, it was outlined that 3,000 British regulars approaching through Lake Pontchartrain could easily seize the city. But again, Britain backed away from war. The Spanish, having revolted against the rule of Napoleon's brother Joseph, suddenly became British allies, and Wellington, who might have marched at New Orleans in 1808, went to Spain instead. Britain and America had uncannily avoided war for 25 years, but underlying mutual suspicions remained. Thinking American ministers pro-French, the British were still impressing U.S. sailors and seizing U.S. ships under orders in council. When the Shawnee chief Tecumseh and his brother the Prophet fought a final desperate Ohio Valley campaign, losing all at Tippecanoe in 1811, Americans blamed the British for arming and inciting savages. The British saw Americans as covetous of Canada, while Americans saw Britons as scheming to detach New England and annex it to Canada. As if to prove American suspicions, a British agent named John Henry was sent to America to gauge the depth of New England's separatist feeling. When paid a paltry £200 for his efforts, he sold his notes to Madison for $50,000. In June 1812, the British cabinet, finally responding to the pro-American lobby in Parliament, agreed to rescind the practice of impressment. But in the same month, the American Congress, unaware of cabinet actions and goaded to a vote by Western war hawks like Clay and Jackson, declared war on a somewhat surprised Britain. Madison's war message summarized all the old wounds: impressment, seizures of ships at sea, British villainy, and Indian atrocities on the frontier. And so the Americans attacked. General Hull, expecting to take Canada, marched from Detroit and was repulsed. Another American attack at Queenstown was turned back. Admiral Perry won a naval battle, and York, Ontario was burned, triggering a reprisal, the burning of Washington, D.C., but the threat to Canada failed, and it remained British. 5 years later, the Great Lakes were neutralized and the Anglo-American boundary permanently fixed. As hawkish Americans wanted to take Canada, so did some British policymakers still think, as they had in 1808, of dismembering America. Lord Liverpool, the Prime Minister in 1812, did not seek the war, but now that it had come, he hoped to bring about New England separation, revive an Indian barrier state in the Old Northwest, capture New Orleans, and strip America of the Louisiana Purchase. As war began in 1812, all these British aims seemed eminently possible, but as the Canadian War congealed into stalemate, only the Gulf Coast theater remained fluid. Florida, with its great stands of huge oaks so necessary for ships of the line, seemed a worthy prize, and New Orleans was the gateway to the Mississippi Valley. British warships were stationed off the Florida coast, beckoning the Indians and promising intervention. The Royal Navy and merchants provided munitions while Spain looked on. British admirals Frederick Warren and Alexander Cochrane corresponded with the ministry, again laying plans for the attack on New Orleans. Cochrane had married the daughter of a New York merchant, but despite this, he insisted, "I bear no goodwill toward the United States." The admirals proposed using Indian troops and slaves to capture the city, and a 1,200-man free black regiment from the Bahamas to garrison it afterwards. The ministry hesitated, and while they did, a group of Creeks, the Red Sticks, attacked a fort near Mobile. Andrew Jackson, with Cherokees as allies, exacted a stinging vengeance. No British help came for the Indians in 1812, nor in 1813, despite the admiral's continued demands for action. By spring 1814, Napoleon was exiled to Elba, and Britain was at last ready to finish the war with America. Admiral Alexander Cochrane, overall commander, expected that New England, the Gulf Coast, and the Louisiana Purchase territory would soon be a part of the British Empire. Cochrane's squadron arrived off the Florida coast at the Apalachicola River on May 10, 1814, and began supplying the Creeks and Seminoles with 3,000 muskets as well as pistols, carbines, and rifles, and over 1 million rounds of ammunition. British agents also told the Indians that King George was their protector. All was in readiness, but Cochrane had been unable to calculate one vital circumstance: the presence of Andrew Jackson. Indomitable, indefatigable, and implacable in his hatred of Britain, Jackson took Mobile, drove the British from Pensacola, and prepared for what he called a fandango at New Orleans. It used to be said that the Battle of New Orleans was pointless because the Treaty of Ghent was signed 2 weeks before the battle in December 1814. Historians now recognize that this was not true. The Treaty of Ghent made no mention of the Louisiana Purchase because Britain did not acknowledge it as a lawful and legal document. As Robert V. Remini, Jackson's biographer, has pointed out, England in 1814 believed that, quote, none of the lower Mississippi or New Orleans or any of the Gulf Coast belonged to the United States, unquote. Had Britain succeeded in New Orleans, it would have occupied the Louisiana Territory and the Gulf Coast. Jackson's victory prevented this and made Louisiana, by conquest as well as by law, a possession of the United States. Britain's retreat from the area was final. A quid pro quo was struck. Britain recognized American sovereignty in the Mississippi Valley and the Gulf Coast, and America recognized British sovereignty in Canada. 34 years before the Battle of New Orleans, after Yorktown in 1781, when word reached Britain that Lord Cornwallis had surrendered his entire army to George Washington, the Prime Minister, Lord North, is said to have gasped, "Oh God, it's over." His words were certainly premature, for in the interval between 1781 and 1815, British cabinet ministers, admirals, loyalists, traders, and Indian chiefs, with the help of a variety of respectable and disreputable Americans, connived and schemed to nullify Cornwallis's surrender and bring Britain back to the American mainland. It was only after the Battle of New Orleans, right here on this battlefield, that Americans could finally say of Britain's long effort to control the U.S. hinterlands, in paraphrase of Lord North, "Thank God it's over."